everyone. I'm Ari Meglin here with Rachel Poley, and we're your hosts for the Merry Writer podcast. We are on episode 51, and this week's question is, what is the one thing you wish you were better at as a writer? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening so you never miss a show. And if you enjoy this episode, please do give it a like. Today, we welcome writer Mark Gelinas Snr onto the show. Mark, it is great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So is this your first podcast, or have you been on others?
Actually, it is not. I was on Renee's Amuse Bouche Review, I think it's called. Although the funny thing is, I did that back in December, right about Christmas time, and their editing process takes a lot longer. So it has not been released yet. So as far as podcasts being released, yours will be the first.
Oh, okay. Wow. Do we do ours really fast? Is that it? Or are we just really slow?
Well, I reckon so. We're recording it this week and we release next week. That's pretty reasonable. Some podcasts I've heard, they'll record it and release it like the same night. I don't know how they do that.
I couldn't imagine that because obviously we do have to edit, and let's see, I think we had a 50-minute episode, which is usually the longest. We try and keep it a lot under that. And it took me over 2.5 hours to edit. So yeah, it's I couldn't imagine doing everything in one day and releasing it. No, that's way too much pressure.
Oh, yeah.
I have to say, because obviously I know you're on Twitter and everything, what does the E stand for in your name?
The E, surprisingly, does not stand for Elderac, even though that's my Twitter name. The E stands for Eugene.
I would never have got that at all.
I'm named after my uncle, who was, I believe, named after his great uncle.
Oh,
nice.
Because obviously that's whenever we see you on Twitter, it's Elderac that sort of jumps up. And it's obviously just assumed because you've got the E as your initial that would be what it is.
Yeah, and that's why I put this in my notes. Elderac is not my middle name.
That's a really unusual middle name, and it's like, it's not. Though, to be honest, it's like I don't hear Eugene very often either.
No, Elderac is the name of a character from an early unfinished collaboration. So I kind of adapted it for my email address, and I use it for various online presences.
Yeah, I think quite a few writers have started doing that, using like character names or series names as part of their Twitter handles or websites and things. Oh, you see, you learn something new every day.
Yes.
I like it. It rolls right off the tongue.
Obviously, the main question of the podcast is, what is the one thing you wish you were better at as a writer? And as usual with guests, we have broken it down. So what area in writing do you struggle with the most?
Perhaps the area I struggle with most is description. It's not so much that I can't describe something. It's a matter of how much description to use and what to include in that description. Let me give you a couple of examples here. This is from the first draft of the YA novel Eyes on the Road. His mother was shorter than he was and had light brown hair and blue eyes. She wore a black skirt jacket over a peach blouse. Pinned on one breast was a name tag identifying her as Margaret Hampton, financial advisor of the Royal Bank of Canada. That was from the first draft. Now let me read you what made it into our final publication. He went to the kitchen where his mother would be relaxing before her job at the bank. "Bonjour, maman," he said, and kissed her on the cheek. Without peering up from her newspaper, she said in French, "Your father and I had a talk this morning." So everything from that first description, the only thing that made it to the second description was the fact that she worked at a bank. I was over-describing in the first one, and we trimmed it down to just what was really essential. So all of the description of her appearance is gone, and we get right down to what's important. I think part of the problem is I might just need to adjust the description for the genre that I'm writing. Different genres have different levels of description. Action stories usually have a bare minimum of description to keep the action moving, but that's not always the case. Let me give you an example here. This is from Clive Cussler. It's a book called The Chase, and it's definitely an action story. All right. And here the MC says, "That's a mighty fine locomotive." The engineer looked up. He was shorter than Bell, with strands of salt and pepper hair straying from under his cap. The face was craggy from years of leaning out the cab window in the full stream of a speeding engine. The eyebrows over a pair of sky blue eyes were curved and bushy. Bell judged that he was younger than he looked. Now, that's a pretty lengthy description for something that's very near the end of the book. Now, romance stories tend to stop and smell the roses. They appeal to the senses so that most romance writers fill their books with details about clothing, appearance, food, flowers, etc. I have an excerpt from Debbie McComer's book, The Inn at Rose Harbor. I was meant to own this bed and breakfast, as if it sat on the market all those months waiting for me. It had 8 guest rooms spread across 2 upper floors, and the bottom floor, a large modern kitchen, was situated next to the spacious dining room. Originally built in the 1900s, the house looked out on a stunning panorama of water and marina. Cedar Cove was laid out below along Harbor Street, which wound through the town with small shops on both sides of the street. I felt the town's appeal even before I had the opportunity to explore its neighborhood. So there we get a very thorough description of this bed and breakfast. Will feature in several of her books, because she has a series about the Inn at the Rose Harbor, and that was from the first book there. But you can see it had details like when the inn was built, how many rooms it had, and that sort of thing. Now, when we get to mysteries are similar to romance in that they have a lot of details. That's where the writers will hide the clues. And this excerpt is from Sue Grafton's J.S. for Judgment. And before I read this, let me say that Miss Grafton kind of violates one of the rules about description, but she's a best-selling author, so what can you say? I would have checked my reflection, but I didn't carry a compact and I already knew what I would see. Dark hair, hazel eyes, not a smidge of makeup. As usual, I was wearing jeans, my boots, and a turtleneck. I licked my palm and ran my hand across my shaggy head, hoping to smooth down any stuck-up parts. The week before, in a fit of exasperation, I picked up a pair of nail scissors and whacked all my hair off. The results were just about what you would expect. Sounds like kind of a COVID haircut there. But you see that she gives all this, a very lengthy description of herself, and avoids kind of backdoors the look in the mirror technique that some writers who use the first person do. It's usually better to kind of give us bits and pieces as other people see them. In literature, depending on the author, some will use descriptions to enhance the theme of the story, like the dark brooding clouds, the colors in the room, and that sort of thing. So we have a wide spectrum of descriptions, either very, very sparse or to very, very detailed. On one end of the spectrum, we have H.P. Lovecraft, where the purple practically drips off the page. We often joke that it takes 3 pages to describe what the main character has already declared is indescribable. And then on the other end, there is Hemingway. And you probably heard, I probably have seen the joke that I tell about Hemingway on Twitter. But anyways, I'll tell it again. Why did the Hemingway chicken cross the street to die alone in the rain? That's one of my favorite jokes. But it illustrates, how sparse Hemingway's descriptions were. Now, in his book, I'm going to refer to Stephen King's book on writing here. He has some suggestions about description. Good description is a learned skill. So you need to read a lot and you need to write a lot to learn that skill. Good description is a visualization of what you want the reader to experience. Okay, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here. These are not necessarily direct quotes. So, don't come after me, Stephen. Thin description leaves the reader bewildered. Over description buries them in details. Stephen King is not keen on writing that exhaustively describes physical characteristics and clothing. So obviously he would disagree with Miss Grafton. And good description consists of a few well-chosen details that stand for everything else. And I think further in that area, he says about 3 or 4 things that would stand out to someone who has entered the scene is good for a description.
I have to say, it's really weird when you mentioned about the fact that different genres use description mostly in a different way, because it never dawned on me for that. Because I only mainly write fantasy, but having read things like mystery and romance books, it's so noticeable now thinking back. It's like, I do remember seeing a lot more flowery description in romance, a lot more like a deeper sense of description in romance. And mystery is always interesting because, as you said, that's where they hide the clues. So there's often a lot more description because there's so many clues and then hidden clues and then red herrings. But it's making me think back to my own description. Have I been doing it okay?
For me, I have to say, I agree with you, Mark. Description is one of the areas that I struggle with the most when it comes to writing. I've always excelled in dialogue, and a lot of my earlier works, it's mainly just dialogue with, some description in the tags, and that's it. I've never been good at describing the setting or even physical characteristics or anything like that. And like you, Ari, it never dawned on me that description is going to vary depending on what the genre is either. And looking at mysteries, as I write mysteries, you're saying the description, like a lot of the clues are in the description, but with the way I write my stories, a lot of the clues are actually hidden in what people say.
Oh yeah.
So it's kind of, yeah, like instead of working to improve my description, I'm just going to keep working on my dialogue.
I think I've always found I enjoy descriptions of like places and rooms, not like intense. I've never been one for all the descriptions done at once. It's like they go into the room and there's the chandelier and the thick carpets and where they put everything in like 3 paragraphs. I don't like that.
Table in the middle of the room.
Yeah, it's like I think it's always better if it's tied in with action. So you've got a character who walks into the room and the first thing they see is like maybe the opulence of it if they're not used to it, and then maybe they are shunted towards a table where they're picking up like fine china or something. I couldn't think of any word of something fine and like crystal goblet or something, and as they're looking around the room they see somebody stood by an expensive statue, and that's how you kind of, rather than doing this info dump of description, kind of have it wound through. But actually going back to the first part where you said about your own draft and you had the description of the character, I think that's quite typical, isn't it? Especially with starting writing, we always have that kind of panic where we have to describe everyone, and then as you said, when you go back through it, you're like, does this character need so much description? It's like you can just say that she was like brushing her auburn hair out of her face in the wind, and that's enough. So it just goes to show the difference between a first draft and a final draft.
Oh yeah. My beta reader gave me a hard time about all my descriptions. You got to describe everybody you meet. We toned it down a lot.
Yeah.
And it's hard too to decide, to go back and look at your writing and decide, all right, well, what does the reader need and what do they not need? That's one of the hardest decisions. I mean, that's the beauty of editing, but it's very difficult to decide what actually works with the story and what doesn't.
Yeah.
Perhaps part of my problem is my earlier novels I wrote for NaNoWriMo. And when you're doing NaNoWriMo, word count is important. So a nice lengthy description, you're right there.
Yep. I'm the same way. Except my characters just do stupid crap just to fill in the pages.
Oh yeah.
Oh, then again, as long as you get your word counts, in the end, even if the story from NaNoWriMo isn't used or isn't viable, it's just the habit, isn't it? It's helping the habit. So that's always a good thing.
It's also writing. And, we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're still building a foundation for something. So I am going to, now that we've talked a little bit about, what we struggle with, I'm going to ask you, what methods have you used to improve your writing craft? Well,
I've been writing for a few years, and I will say best way to improve your writing is to write. In her book, Writing Magic, Gail Carson Levine has a list of writing rules. The first 3 rules in her list are: the best way to write better is to write more. That's rule 1, rule 2, and rule 3. All right. It's almost like, that one-ups the Fight Club. If you're familiar with the rules of Fight Club.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she says that the best way to write better is to write more. As I become interested in writing fiction, I started studying to improve my craft. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of books that will help teach someone, ranging from very general to very specific topics. Here's some that I recommend. There's Writing Magic, which I've already mentioned, by Gail Carson Levine. This is a book more for a beginner because the chapters are very short. The language is very easy to comprehend and very easy to digest. All right. And I have sent this book off as a gift, if you will, to many beginning writers. All right. In fact, I just sent the copy I had off to the daughter of a friend of mine because I'd heard when we were talking, he mentioned that, she was writing fanfic. So I sent her a copy, hoping that maybe it will help inspire her to write more. But even though it's written for young people, any starting writer can benefit from it because it was a book that I sent to Carrie when we were first talking about some of her writing, and she found it helpful. So it's not just for beginning writers, and I read it myself about once a year. Another book, also by Gail Carson Levine, is Writer to Writer. It goes deeper in topics. Basically, she has a blog, and she's taken a lot of the blog topics and formatted it into a book. It's not just a pure blog blog, 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 but she's taken it, her answers and questions, and put them in topical paragraphs or chapters and put them in a book that's called Writer to Writer. Now, the next one is Save the Cat Writes a Novel. It was written by Jessica Brody, but it's based on the original Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. And the original book, Save the Cat, describes how to do a screenplay and the structure for a screenplay. When I started using Save the Cat, I started finishing stories. Before then, I would write and I wouldn't quite get to the end. When I started looking at the structure and started kind of following that, I was able to finish my stories. I got to the end. All right. Now, Save the Cat was originally written for screenplays, but they knew that a lot of writers were also using it. So unfortunately, Mr. Snyder passed away, and Jessica Brody took his works and wrote Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is basically a compilation of his original work geared towards novel writing, and it also includes samples of each of the genres that Mr. Snyder included. And another book is On Writing, which I mentioned earlier, by Stephen King. The first half of the book is a biography of Mr. King, which is kind of interesting. But the second half is perhaps the better half, where he gets down and talks about the craft of writing. And that's where I pulled the information for the description of that I gave you earlier. Now, other than that, I also listen to podcasts like the Merry Writer podcast, and I don't commute as much as I did because now I'm working at home, so I don't have as much time to listen to podcasts. But when I did, and I had a set in my car that could actually play them, then I would listen to podcasts to fill the empty time while I'm driving to and from work. Another place, and something I've been doing more lately, and after years of resisting, is reading my text out loud. Now, I don't necessarily read it myself, but Word has a program, has a function that will read it to you. I let Microsoft Word read it to me, and it's amazing the things that I've come across just listening to Microsoft Word reading to and following along as it does. Critique groups are good if you can find one. I've been participating in a weekly critique group called Line by Line Time, sponsored by George Beckman. They're on Twitter, and that's on Wednesday nights at 9:00. Basically, George will post a subject, and we will post a clipping from our work in progress. We'll discuss it with each other and find ways to improve. Now, this week's topic, which will be tonight, is about description, as it may happen. So I've already picked out a piece from my work in progress that describes a dress that Hannah is wearing at a formal ball in San Francisco. But writers groups and other critique groups can be helpful if you can find a good one. And that's the key. You got to find a good one. Some other things that I'm aware of, but have not yet participated in, the writing tracks at conventions. Some of the larger conventions will have a complete track of seminars geared towards writing. I know that the one nearby here in Atlanta called DragonCon, that has a track, but I think WorldCon usually has a track just for writers. And so those big conventions will attract a lot of writers that will provide those seminars. So it'd be good. They're good places to go and learn. Other things are like writing classes. People could check out the local community college, see if there's a creative writing classes that they can maybe even audit that will help them learn a little bit more about the writing craft. They don't necessarily have to go and get a full degree in order to benefit from that. And there are also writing workshops and conferences all over the place. And I might get into some of those sooner or later.
Mark, you are so knowledgeable with this stuff. Holy crap. Those writing books that you mentioned, I have not heard of Writing Magic or Writer to Writer. So I'll be writing that down and picking up a copy at some point. I do have Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, but I haven't read it yet. And I think I knew that there was the Save the Cat Writes a Novel, but that's something that's been on my list. And On Writing by Stephen King, that's a book that pretty much everybody talks about and recommends. And I am just one of those people that have not read it. Ari's making a face. Have you not read it either? No.
I see it everywhere. I think it might be because I am not a Stephen King fan. I have read, I think it's probably because I didn't read any of his bigger works. I didn't read It or Pet Sematary or Misery. I think the first book I read of his was Rose Madder, and I hated it. And then I read halfway through Gerald's Game, and I hated it. So I was just like, ugh, don't like it. So while I have heard of it, and I actually do like listening to him on like this on YouTube videos and things, I just haven't got around to getting that and reading it because I didn't like some of his books.
Yeah, it's just it's one of those books that always gets away from you.
I've never read Stephen King.
Neither have I.
Except for On Writing. And there was another book of his, I think it's called Danse Macabre, that deals more with writing horror novels. Now, you may not necessarily want to read that one, but if you pick up On Writing, you might just want to skip over his biography and go right to the writing section, as it does have some really good information. And it's like anything out there. Take what you need, leave the rest.
Yeah, there's a lot of writers who are good at because obviously he's been writing for a long time, so he'll have got better. And I think like the book I read, Rose Madder, was one of his earlier ones, and I think he's probably got so much better. And obviously he then puts all that knowledge into these books, like on writing. So I can imagine it would be a really good book to have. I just haven't got it yet.
Yeah, we're behind on that. But I like what you said. Take what you need and leave the rest. That kind of brings me on to my next point you mentioned about critique groups. I'm part of a local critique group through my library, and granted, we haven't seen each other in person for a year because of COVID, but we've done our best to try to meet virtually through Zoom, at least like once a month or once every couple of months. And I really do highly recommend finding yourself a critique group with the right group of people. My sister and I, we've been part of it since 2015, and there have been a lot of writers who have come and gone, but each one has given us their own useful piece of information. And it's all networking too. You're still meeting new writers, regardless of whether they write in the same genre or not. And the whole take what you need, leave what you don't. I remember the original person who put together my critique group back in the day, he told us, if you're able to get 30% of the feedback and use that for your novel, that's good. Because in the end, it's still your novel. Like, this is all suggestions. It's not set in stone. Just because one person says you need to change something doesn't mean you have to do it.
Right.
And it's helpful.
All right. Let me add 2 points here. First of all, we're talking about critique groups. Now, one of the easiest way to find a critique group is sign up for NaNoWriMo and find your local group of people, because usually they'll hold little get-togethers during November, and maybe that'd be a way to find like-minded people that you can start working with. Also, you mentioned YouTube. That's another source of learning that I've recently started using. Like, for example, Mary Robinette Kowal has a series on writing short stories, and some of the other writers have series on writing on those. And again, take what you need, leave the rest.
I actually used Nano to find, I was part of my critique group before, and then there was one Nano I posted my local library. I was like, is anybody going to be doing Nano in this area? Can we meet up at the library? And a person responded, and her roommate and my sister and I, we all got together at a Starbucks and we wrote together, and we've been friends ever since. They're part of my writing group now, and we also have a Dungeons and Dragons group together. So see, you make friends.
That's it. That's perfect. It's like, because I think writing is a very solitary thing, so it's kind of nice if you can connect. And while it is nice to do it online, especially now with the pandemic and you can't go anywhere, it is nice if you can actually meet them, and have someone face to face, and have those more, like, I don't want to use the word intimate because it sounds weird, but intimate groups.
I know what you mean.
Can I just say, I love the idea of using Microsoft Word to read, because I do know that it is supposed to be a really good thing to have your words either read out by yourself, somebody else, or a program, because it does catch things you don't hear. Never dawned on me about Microsoft Word. I've always thought about all these other programs like Dragon Speak and all these like fancy apps.
On your Microsoft Word, all right, you go to the tab that says Review, and then over on the left-hand side, it says Read Aloud. You just click that, and it'll start reading from wherever you are. All right, so if you wanted to read the whole document, you got to make sure you go to the front. Also, it has 3 different voices.
I didn't even know this was a thing.
I don't think mine has that, because I can't see that.
Episode Yeah, you can probably hear it going in the background there. Mark Gelinas Snr. It's reading the. Just reading our script here.
Oh,
but
we're not even needed. We don't even need to be here anymore. Word can do our episode.
It'll stumble over words, but it's not the names that you're worried about. It's, grammar, words you left out, places where you drop the Y off of they. That's a problem I have all the time. I get typing along, and either I will take the first letter of the next word and attach it to the previous word, or just drop off a word. I don't know if you guys have that problem or not, but a really bad one for me is they. All right. So I'll be going along and, the went to the store. What? The what went to the store? Oh, that's supposed to be they went to the store. And so it's good for helping find things like that. Pause it, fix it, and carry on.
It's like there's so many times you edit, and by the end you have that editor blindness where you just keep skimming over the same error, but hearing it in another medium, or like even just changing the size of the text, makes such a big difference. Because it's so frustrating. Like, you're on draft 7 and you're still finding errors that are so obvious.
Well, that's one of the reasons we also have beta readers and editors, to catch those things that we don't. I mean, I work in the tech editing field, and during the day, we have several reviews of a document before we send it out the door. And even at the very last check, sometimes we will find something that needs to be fixed and incorporated before we send it out the door. So it's good to have other people look at your work. Beta readers will be the first place. Looking at it yourself, have either read it or have someone read it for you, like Microsoft Word, and then send it off to an editor. All of those helps make your story that much better.
I think that leads quite nicely on to our last question, which is, what's your strength when it comes to writing?
I think my strength is dialogue. When I'm writing, if I can get 2 or more people talking, the words just flow. I can just get in the zone and get typing dialogue, and before I know it, I got several hundred words down. But sometimes, like when I'm doing a word sprint or something like that, I'll just go and do the dialogue, and then maybe the next morning I'll have to go back in and put in, okay, who said that? Okay, he said this here, she said that, and put in the dialogue tags and the subtext and description around it. But when I get people talking, the words can flow. So I think I'm pretty good at dialogue. If a story requires an MC to be alone for a long time, I might write it in the first person, because that means I can go into internal dialogue. All right. So it's not, she went here, she did that, she went there, she did that, without any dialogue at all. And that's probably one of the reasons that H.P. Lovecraft doesn't have more of the stories made into movies, because he just has a lot of description, but not very much dialogue. And, when you go to a movie, people are always talking. So, they'd have to make up a lot of dialogue for his stories. And you can't do first person in a movie. So if an MC's got to be alone for a long time, or especially if an MC is in a detective story or a romance story, then first person is probably a better point of view to use. Although you might alter first person between the main character, female character in a romance or whatever, and go back and forth like that. But still, first person is quite often used in romance. And I think I'm digressing here from dialogue. But, if someone has trouble writing dialogues, they could try these different things. Listen to people talk. Either go to a movie, although the dialogue in a movie is not always the best, but listen to the interaction of the people, or, go in a public place, like, in a mall, and listen to people talking. And it's not quite necessarily eavesdropping if they're talking loud enough for other people to hear. All right. If you got a strain to hear them, then maybe you shouldn't be doing that. But, if they're walking by, you can hear little bits and pieces of their conversation. That could help you. That could inform you on how people talk. And again, we're talking about reading what you write. Read your dialogue. Does it sound natural? Does it sound like something that you could, walk into a room and hear 2 people saying? Remember that dialogue is back and forth between 2 or more people. Don't have one person going on and on, which brings me to my next point. Unless someone is given a speech or an explanation, keep each bit short, maybe 2 or 3 sentences, 3 sentences at the most, before flipping it over to the next person. Have someone respond, even if they say, okay, yeah, sure, great, or whatever, but have that back and forth going. And for dialogue, give your characters a foil, someone that doesn't necessarily agree with them. They may be friendly with them, but they don't necessarily agree with them, so that they can offer a counterpoint to whatever the speaker is saying, and that helps with the dialogue going back and forth.
I have to say, I write mostly in third person, and I'm not third person limited. I don't stick to one character. I usually, I'm in different heads. And I have been trying more first person. And it was funny when you mentioned the movies and everything, because obviously if you've got like a single character, it's hard, because obviously unless the character's talking to themselves a lot. I mean, I think of movies where there was like one character, like in the sci-fi movie Moon with, can't remember his name. I want to say Sam Rockwell, but I might be wrong. And then they had to have like a computer that he could talk to and then kind of like figure things out with. But it does remind me of the old film noir with the detective who had that, like, the internal narrator. Everything he did, it was like stood in the rain, or watching someone do something, or the woman that came into his office, and everything was like internal of him talking about it in movies. And
like a narrator over.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is interesting, especially if you are writing characters who are alone a lot. It
Mm-hmm.
can get a bit awkward unless they're literally just chatting away to themselves. But yeah, I think that's probably one of the reasons why I do stick to third person. I think it's easier to write in third person than first person, because you have other people's heads you can get into. You have that extra stretch. Oh, yeah.
Well, another advantage of third person is you can show things that's going on that the main character cannot necessarily see.
Yeah.
See, with my mystery novel, I started off in first person through George's eyes, and then I realized that was a really poor choice. So after a couple of different POV switches, throughout all the different drafts, I finally settled on third person limited with Lila. Not first person, but like we're still sort of in her head. And a lot of the times when she's by herself, yeah, she's the one talking to herself, because I'm terrible at description.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've noticed has become quite popular. I didn't remember it being quite popular before, is people who write first person, but each chapter switches between the two main characters. So you do get to see what's going on in somebody else's head from their point of view. So that used to be, if you wanted to go in other people's heads, it was third person all the way. And now there seems to be a lot more first person, multiple characters in books. So I kind of like that. That's cool.
There's a book that I read called An Innocent Traitor, and each chapter was written in first person, but each chapter is a different character, and they cycle between 4 and 5 characters. And
wow.
When I went from the first chapter to the second chapter, it kind of threw me, because okay, now we got a new person that's in first person. It was actually a pretty good book, but it was just the structure just kind of threw me, because you went from first person to first person to first person.
I've seen it with the maximum 3 characters, and usually one of the 3 characters is only in it a few times. They've sort of dropped them in maybe near the end. I can't imagine having more than three character views in first person. That seems quite complicated, because by the time you got to like character 5, you'll have forgotten what character 1 was doing. So I don't know, that seems a little bit.
Yeah, like how does the writer keep track? Let alone the reader.
Well, in the one of the work in progress I've got here, my beta said, oh no, the main characters died, because I had like several chapters where the main character didn't appear. So I had to go back and write some fill-in chapters so we can go from, the antag to the protag and back and forth. And I was working on that and I had to go back and do that. So it's important to keep your main character in the view of the reader.
Yeah.
Otherwise they'll forget, well, was that the main character, or is this person the main character?
Yeah, I think that can happen, especially if you have multiple characters. Like as I said, I write third person, and I usually have several characters. Obviously, you can tell the main characters, but I will pop into side characters' heads. And it's usually when I've laid out all the scenes on the floor and I'm putting the chapters, I'm breaking the chapters up, and I'm like, oh, we haven't seen the second main character for like 18 chapters. And then it's like, I need to fix the outline again. And it is so easy to, if you don't have that kind of overall look where you can kind of spot it, it's so easy to forget that you haven't mentioned someone because you're caught up in the story and the character you're writing at the moment that you've forgotten that there's somebody waiting in the wings that needs to come back in. Okay, I think we covered loads in this. You've covered everything about regarding dialogue and description, and the resources that you mentioned. I will be putting them in the description below because we all love resources. I have to say, just as an extra point, I have Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I have had it for months and it's like next to the bed. I'm going to read that and then I keep forgetting, and now I really want to read it because I am not finishing my work and I need to, and it sounds like that's what I need to do. Okay, so obviously I want to say a big thank you to Mark for joining us today. Do you want to tell our listeners anything about yourself?
Yes, I've been writing on and off for more years than I'm willing to admit. I wrote my first novel when I was about 13. It was a science fiction piece called Space Pirate Terror. And since I'd not heard the Merry Writer podcast about authors putting themselves in their work, the main character was a fictionalized version of me. So obviously I'd have to do a lot of changes to that story before I would be able to release it. And then other than school papers and sermons, I didn't write much for a number of years. And after joining the Navy, I took a chance and submitted an article for a gaming magazine. And that was the beginning of many years of writing articles, newsletters, and gaming supplements. One of the jobs I had in the Navy was an instructor, during which I would have to write course material, prepare lessons guides, write procedures, and write questions. All of this and the technical training that went along with that prepared me in a way for becoming a technical writer once I got out of the Navy. So now my day job is technical writing, and my nights I write fiction. In 2005, I attempted to write a novel during NaNoWriMo and discovered that I could successfully work in that format, that is a novel format. However, my writing seemed to fall off after December until about 2 years ago when I asked my writing buddy, Carrie Davison, from another member of the Merry Writer community, and your first guest as it was, and I met her through the Merry Writer hashtag game. Anyways, I asked her to check on me every day for about 21 days. Just ask me, what did you write today? And that accountability of having to answer someone every day for like 21 days got me in a habit of writing every day. And since that time, I've been mostly writing every day. Either, if not directly writing something, I am researching, I'm brainstorming, I'm editing, I'm working towards a story every day. Since then, we have shared and commented on each other's works. I helped her with, I was like a beta reader for Soul's Choice and The Soul Must Go On, and her most recent one, the Beneath the Snow. But this past year, Carrie suggested that we write something together. It was just going to start out as an exercise, and writing, collaborating together. And it worked amazingly well. Once we got started, we just got caught up in the story. And what started as an experiment has turned into our first co-authored book. Now, for my YA collaborations, I'll be using the name Mark Gelinas. For my other fiction, I'll be using some variation of Mark E. Gelinas Snr. So that's a little bit about me, and you can find me on Twitter at Elderac, and I'm a co-host of the Writerly WIP chat daily hashtag game, and I'm also on Facebook.
Awesome. Obviously, all links to Mark's social media will be listed below in the description, so do go check them out and give him a follow, and obviously try out that hashtag game. We all love hashtags games. As always, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Do let us know one thing you wish you were better at as a writer. Put it in the comments or on Twitter using the hashtag The Merry Writer Podcast. If you want to get yourself some extra content, head over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/The Merry Writer Podcast. You can support our show for as little as $1 a month and get yourself some bonus content. Do tune in again next week for another episode of the Merry Writer Podcast where we ask all the right questions. Thanks for listening. Bye.
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 This podcast is brought to you by Scraps of Paper. We have notes everywhere. The music titled Inspired is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons 4.0.